Reasonable accommodation shorts. What's a reasonable accommodation? A reasonable accommodation is a change, adaptation, or modification to a policy, program, or service which will allow a person with a disability, as defined under this federal civil rights law, the equal opportunity to participate fully in the division of housing programs. Examples of a reasonable accommodation: providing time extensions for locating a unit, permitting participants to rent from a relative, permitting participants to have a live-in aid, exception to payment standards for accessible units. Initial request. Once a tenant tells a housing provider that they are a person with a disability and needs something changed in order to accommodate their disability, the provider is obligated to begin the reasonable accommodation process. How to make a request? A request may be oral or written. However, the best practice is to request the accommodation in writing so that there is a clear record of the request. If a participant is unable to write the request can be heard orally and written for the individual, allowing them to confirm the accuracy. Verification for reasonable accommodation. A reasonable accommodation must be verified and documented initially by a third-party knowledgeable professional. A certification of continued need for a reasonable accommodation must be made annually. Third-party verification of the continued need will not be required if the family certifies that the accommodation is still needed. If the granted accommodation is unit-specific, the request must be re-verified at the time the participant moves into a new unit. Disability. The request needs to demonstrate that the tenant has a disability that could be accommodated by the specific request. It does not need to state the specific type of disability. A housing provider cannot ask about the diagnosis, treatment, or the nature or extent of the disability. A person with a disability, as defined under the federal civil rights law, is any person who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, or has a record of such impairment, or is regarded as having such impairment. Nexus to disability. An accommodation must be reasonable and there must be an identifiable relationship between the requested accommodation and the applicant or participant's disability. Describe in a few sentences how the symptoms affect the person connecting to the request. Public housing authorities do not fall under HIPAA, and any diagnosis must be redacted. Who is a knowledgeable professional? Third-party verification must be obtained from an individual identified by the family who is competent to make the determination. A doctor or other medical professional, a peer support group, a non-medical service agency, or a reliable third party who is in a position to know about the individual's disability may provide verification of a disability. Who can't sign the verification of need? The knowledgeable professional cannot be directly affiliated with the management of the housing assistance voucher assistance. When can a housing provider, such as the Division of Housing, deny a reasonable accommodation request? A request was not made by or on behalf of the person with a disability. No disability-related need for the accommodation. An accommodation is not reasonable. It imposes an undue financial and administrative burden, causes a fundamental alteration to the nature of the program. Annual follow-up. Verification of continued need of reasonable accommodation form is required at annual reexamination. Documentation from a knowledgeable professional is not required at annual reexamination. Exceptions that require a full documentation. If a participant moves and has a unit-specific accommodation, such as an exception to the payment standard. Division of Housing policy, process, and forms. Your Division of Housing single point of contact will review the documentation to determine if the request is in accordance with HUD regulations in the Division of Housing policy and/or if additional documentation is needed. Division of Housing will send notification of approval to the housing agency, and the agency will notify the participant. Division of Housing will send notification of denial directly to the participant and will copy the housing agency. Division of Housing will make a notation in Elite using the hot list. Reasonable accommodation form can be found on the Division of Housing website listed below. This is what the request for a reasonable accommodation looks like. Verification of need form. The knowledgeable professional can complete the verification of need form found on the Division of Housing website below. This is what the verification of need for a reasonable accommodation looks like. Where to send the request? A reasonable accommodation and verification of need forms are to be sent to the single point of contact for your agency. If you have further questions about this process, please reach out to your single point of contact.